All right, so I'm sure you've heard a lot of buzzing about the American election. It's everywhere. But one of the buzzings that caught my attention is people talking about certain groups, like Hispanics, potentially voting for Trump in large numbers. Now, I'll believe it when I see it, but let's talk about it. I believe I even heard Nick Fuentes suggesting that Republicans, if they want to win, should attempt to sway some Hispanic voters. Now, on this channel, I've talked quite a bit about conflicts between whites and non whites, but the reality is, when you live in a multiracial society, you're going to end up with lots of conflicts between every group, right? You may have heard about some of these other conflicts, some of this sort of uneasiness between, let's say, blacks and Asians. Do you remember in Philadelphia, you had Chinese and Korean store owners putting up bulletproof glass? And there was a black, like, city council member who really took aim at that. That was, I think the city council of Philadelphia, like, voted where the Chinese and Korean store owners had to take it down, maybe, if I'm remembering that right. You also have conflict between the black and Hispanic communities, which is potentially relevant for this election. You know, I've heard some black people talk about Hispanics taking over formerly black neighborhoods, and they were speaking very venomously about some of the Hispanics. There's been some racially motivated attacks between these communities. Here's a news article from the LA Times about a firebombing that was done against black families by a Hispanic gang. And some of the gang violence that you see between Hispanic gangs and black gangs is sometimes particularly brutal. I mean, you have like Hispanic gang on Hispanic gang violence, obviously, and black gang on black gang. But when it's between the two groups, some of that gets a little bit more gruesome than normal. And with the Democrats backing Black Lives Matter and these rioters, this could cause some Hispanics to maybe reevaluate their political position, right? If Democrats are siding with BLM and very much flying that flag, all of a sudden, Republicans might not look so bad to some of those Hispanics. Now, obviously, if a bunch of Hispanics do flip Republican, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's no conflict between whites and Hispanics. It just means that some of the flippers consider the Democrats unpalatable now that they're backing BLM. And that might be good for Republicans in a way, to help them just get some more numbers. Ultimately, I don't consider it a good thing for whites, though, and I'll explain why in a minute. And, I've seen some people suggest that if Hispanics voted for Republicans in large numbers, this would disprove the idea of the heritability of political views and the pre-political nature of race, which I've spoken about. It would prove that culture trumps genetics, genes don't really matter in the political realm. And if you see people suggest that, you might want to remind them that the scientific evidence on the heritability of political views that we have been pointing out points to policies and policy views being more heritable than the somewhat ephemeral political party support, right? Political parties change over time, and their platforms are large and complex, but also changing situations could change which policies you think are the most important to address at the time, right? Political party support isn't really what we're talking about when we're talking about the heritability of political views. So just as an example, let's say you were to agree with the Republicans on some things, let's say the economy and foreign policy, but the Democrats on others, right? Well, let's say there's a big crime wave, and then at some other point there's a bad economy, and then there's a massive drug wave, and then there's some large international incident. Over time, even if none of your policy views changed, you could end up voting for different political parties at different times based off of what you considered the most important thing to address at that time. So Hispanics voting for Republicans doesn't necessarily mean that they're deciding that the ideological basis of the Republican platform is something they wholeheartedly support. It's just a matter of practicality, changing circumstances. They can't stand the Democrats anymore because they're not palatable, right? So, heritability of political views isn't about political parties as much as it's about policy. If we look at this study out of Sweden, we can see how much twins have heritability on views on things like immigration, foreign policy, and feminism. Political party support and whether they consider themselves left or right is actually not as heritable. That's not what we're talking about. We're really talking about specific policies. So with that in mind, let's say that these people were right and that the Hispanics were going to be big time Republicans moving forward. Well, that would mean that the Republican Party would have a lot of responsibility to prove to their new constituents that they are willing to advance their agenda so they can keep their new voters. Let's say even a very Hispanic district elected a Republican for the first time. Well, that Republican has a lot to prove. They need to prove that they can advance the political views, which are very heritable, and advance that agenda. So I was looking at this article in The Atlantic. They were looking at how different voting blocks viewed gun rights. Whites are far and away the most pro-gun group, and Hispanics are the most anti-gun. Hispanics in this Pew poll were more likely than whites to say that people should be careful not to offend others. Whites are the most hostile group to hate speech laws and generally the most free speech group there is. Hispanics are not very friendly to the idea of a limited government, not hardly at all. They are very much large central government people. Limited government is more of a white person thing. So when these Republicans need to prove to their new voters, if we are to believe this large Hispanic voting base, well, then they might not want to focus on things like gun rights, which is going to piss them off, right? They largely oppose that. They need to institute new welfare programs that they can benefit from. That's how they need to prove to their new voters. The reality is, if non-whites became a larger voting group within the Republican Party, the Republican Party itself will be less beholden to prove to whites that they are worth our vote. They'll be less concerned with attempting to maintain gun rights, free speech, or anything like that, because their constituency will find those things less and less important as they become less and less white. Now, keep in mind, I understand that Republicans generally fail to deliver on efforts of free speech and gun rights, even if they are willing to pay it lip service. But, are you excited to live in a country where none of the major political parties are beholden to a voting population that values free speech, right? Are you excited that all political parties will have a constituency that mostly supports hate speech laws and restricted free speech? I'm not excited for that. A change in the racial makeup of the votes that go to our political parties is not an indication that big swaths of racial groups are adopting new ideological perspectives. When you see a change in racial makeup of votes, I think what you're seeing is the precursor to future change in the political party platforms. If Hispanics start voting Republican in big numbers, that's just a precursor to the Republican Party being more anti-gun, less free speech, more large centralized government providing benefits, and maybe a little bit more anti-abortion. And they won't be beholden to even pretending that they care about some of the issues that whites care about, like gun rights and free speech. Because genetics matter.